Germany in the 1930s, the cradle of Nazism. As Hitler prepared to dominate Europe, he nursed a dream, the creation of a master race. 10 years later, the innocent victims of Hitler's monstrous plan began to reap the whirlwind he had sown. Only now can we reveal the part one country, Norway, played in their suffering. Frida Lyngstad, singer with the world-famous pop group ABBA, was just one of those whose lives were turned upside down by the fallout from Hitler's great experiment. Few lives remained untouched as the Nazi military machine swept across Europe. Even when the nightmare was over, the after-effects took years to fade. For 10,000 babies born in wartime Norway, Hitler's legacy was to dominate their entire lives. For them, it was as if the war had never ended. As children, they were part of the biggest eugenics experiment the world has ever seen. For years, they suffered in silence, until now.
Når jeg var 3 år, så ble jeg sendt til Emma-hjem for tilbakestående barn, fordi jeg hadde tysk far.
Det tok ikke lange tiden før jeg måtte springe hjem til mamma og spørre hva det var barna kalte meg for, hva det betød tysk skole, for det var det de kalte meg.
Når frigjøringen kom, ble jeg også sendt på et annet barnehjem, der ble jeg seksuell misbruk fordi jeg var tyskerbarn.
These people suffered because of events generated long before their birth. Their story reaches back to the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler's preoccupation with racial purity was growing into an obsession. In 1935 at Nuremberg, Hitler translated his theories into law. From that day on, Germany was subject to a program of racial selection based upon the belief that Aryans were genetically superior. Rassenprüfer, or race examiners, were trained to measure and assess racial purity. Their specifications were precise. Long head, narrow face, well-defined chin, soft fair hair, blue or grey eyes, pink white skin. With strict selective breeding, Hitler expected all racial impurities to be eradicated in 2 generations. To hasten the growth of the master race, there were incentives for those pronounced suitable to reproduce. Women were expected to have at least 4 children for the Führer. If they did, they were rewarded with a medal, the Mother Cross. Hitler chose SS chief Heinrich Himmler, himself an enthusiastic supporter of the master race theory, to implement his policy. He set up special homes where racially approved women could give birth to their children. They were called Lebensborn homes, Lebensborn meaning fountain of life. Helmi Ziegler was a nurse who looked after the women and children at the Lebensborn home in Friesland, northeast Germany.
Dass die Soldaten und die SS-Leute angehalten wurden, dort Kinder in die Welt zu setzen, zur Auffrischung der nordischen Rasse, nicht? Das wissen Sie ja. Und darauf legte man Wert. Nicht? Und die Mütter, die hierher kamen, mussten ja auch einen Ahnenpass beibringen, nicht? Zu den Urgroßeltern.
Himmler ordered the supposedly pure men of the SS to father as many children as possible, not only with their wives, but with any suitable Aryan woman. Helmi Ziegler remembers the effect this had on the men.
Dieser Heimleiter fragte mich eines Tages, Sie könnten doch eigentlich ein Kind haben, so wie sie gebaut sind, so nordisch-germanischer Prägung und denke ein Kind, nicht? Das wäre doch nicht das Richtige. Und wenn mir der Partner fehlte, nicht, stellte er sich zur Verfügung.
Helmi refused his offer, but thousands of women did decide to enter the Lebensborn program. At the homes, they were rewarded with the best medical care. Then they could either take their children home or leave them to be adopted later into an SS family. Himmler took a great personal interest in the well-being of the future master race. Under his imaginative stewardship, Lebensborn became a quasi-religious organization with its own rituals.
Oh ja, ich habe mir zum Beispiel eine Namensgebung miterlebt, wie so ein Kind getauft wurde. Nicht, da kam dann so eine SS-Abteilung aus Bremen und das Ganze. Dann wurde dem Baby ein Dolch auf den Bauch gelegt und es, wie hieß denn so, dein Name ist Heiko, trage deinen Namen in Ehren, nicht so in dem Stil, nicht. Dann wurden also entsprechende Gesänge, vaterländische Gesänge wurden angestimmt und hinterher war dann auch noch ein Essen und so ein Remi-Demi.
There was a sinister urgency to the Lebensborn project. For the other arm of Hitler's racial purity policy was the eradication of those he considered racially undesirable, Jews, Gypsies, and many others. They were to be replaced by the pure Lebensborn. But the scale of the Holocaust deaths was so vast that the numbers of new approved babies simply couldn't keep pace. The program needed to expand. Hitler's army had been rampaging through Europe for over a year. By 1940, he'd set his sights on Norway. The German Navy took on the British fleet in the North Sea, while the Luftwaffe attacked British and Norwegian forces on the ground. Before long, the unstoppable German war machine had moved in, and Norway had become yet another outpost of the Third Reich. The Germans originally wanted Norway for its iron ore, but what turned out to be irresistible were the genes of the people themselves, about as purely Aryan as it was possible to get. The local population was all but swamped by an occupying force of nearly 500,000. Young German soldiers were everywhere. They were outgoing and apparently making an effort to fit in with the locals. Their presence turned village life upside down.
The Germans occupied the houses, and their physical contact with the Norwegians was very close, and there was absolutely no way of escaping this contact for the Norwegians. If you take a small village where maybe in a population of 40 people, maybe there was 4 or 5 young girls from 16 to 18 years, 20 years, and suddenly 400 German soldiers came. It was very, very difficult to avoid that some of these girls and some of these Germans became lovers in some way or another.
Agnes Jensen was one of those girls. She wasn't surprised that the local girls found the German soldiers attractive.
Det vil jeg jo si på mange måter når du liksom sånn, for vet du, de norske ikke kunne de be dem med liksom på kino eller sånn, for vi var jo egentlig ganske, det var jo arbeidsledighet og alt sånt, så de ba deg jo ikke med ut eller noen ting sånn. De hadde jo, de da ba det, nå har jeg aldri vært på sånne fester, men de kunne jo be folk inn i leiren sin da, og ha fest og ha det moro. Og de hadde vel ikke de norske så mange muligheten til, for vet du, det var arbeidsledighet, og de jobbet ikke eller noen ting. Og det er jo ikke snakk om det at ikke de norske var pene eller kjekke nok, men jeg vet ikke. Jeg synes jo det er noe en gang sånn da, at uniformer det trekker, vet du.
Agnes was not the only young Norwegian woman to fall for a German uniform. In other occupied countries, German soldiers were forbidden to make friends with the locals. But in Norway, soldiers were urged to take local lovers as a patriotic duty. The genetic opportunities for the master race were too good to miss. In the far north of Norway, in a small town called Ballangen, a young officer called Alfred Haase was stationed at the German garrison. He was married with a young wife and child waiting for him back home. Alfred was young but ambitious. He'd already risen to captain. On the road leading to his barracks, Alfred daily passed the home of a 19-year-old girl called Sinni Lyngstad. Lots of Alfred's friends had noticed Sinni, but only he had the courage to approach her. She was nervous of him at first. He was an enemy soldier, and local feelings against the Nazis ran high. But he was polite and persistent in his advances. Before long, Sinni had fallen madly in love with Alfred. Sinni's childhood friend, Sara Mura, remembers that Sinni was so much in love, she didn't think of Alfred as an enemy soldier.
Hun sa det, ja, hun liksom pratet om han Alfred. For vi kaller han ikke for Alfred, for vi kaller han for Fred. Og det var en fred ofte i hennes tale, når hun skulle fortelle noe, så var det en fred.
But Sinni's family was less than happy.
I think Sinni's family didn't really like the relationship she was having with Alfred. I think they felt that it was totally inappropriate and potentially dangerous for her as well, because, you know, at some point people must have realized, well, you know, the Germans are not going to win this war, and who knows what's going to happen when they all have to go back to Germany and Sinni is still living there, and everyone knows that she's been having, you know, this relationship with the German soldiers. So I think they feared for her.
Alfred and Sinni were lovers for almost 2 years. Then Alfred was transferred away from Ballangen, and the lovers were parted. 4 months later, he was posted back to Germany. Before he left, he made one last effort to see Sinni.
So he said to himself, I cannot just go because, you know, I leave her here and she doesn't know what happens. So he rented an old bicycle. It was snowing, it was ice, and 30 to 40 kilometers he, you know, biked back to that house.
This was to be the last time Alfred saw Sinni Lyngstad. Neither knew that their last night together had left Sinni pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Annie Frid, but she was to become better known to the world as Frida, singer in the iconic Swedish band ABBA. But Frida was not Swedish, and her father was a Nazi officer. The romance between Frida's parents was fated to end in tears. All across wartime Norway, the stage was being set for the peacetime tragedy yet to come. For Frida was certainly not alone. So many babies were born to German soldiers and their Norwegian lovers that within a year of the occupation, the time was ripe for some new arrangements. The Germans were poised to harvest the latest recruits to the master race plan. Kåre Olsen, an historian working in the state archives in Oslo, has discovered evidence of the plans.
In December 1940, to the Reichsführer SS, also Himmler in Berlin, about children born out of wedlock in Norway. with the German fathers. A letter of 4 pages, SS in Norway, suggests that there should be established German Entbindungsheimen, also institutions for birth, and that should be from Lebensborn. Himmler agreed with the plan, and in March 41 the Lebensborn was established in Norway.
When Agnes Jensen became pregnant by her German lover, the Nazis were immediately interested in her unborn child.
Når jeg ble gravid, så var det vel sånn at jeg fikk et brev om at hvis jeg ville, så kunne jeg føde inn i Oslo på et hjem, hvor det var bare tyskere og tyskerunger, altså. Og så var det tyske som drev det. Jeg har hørt at de skal ha ren rase og sånn, det er jo ikke noe vi tenkte på. Vi var unge og dumme og uskyldige og forelsket vi, det var det vi var. Tenkte jo ikke på noe ren rase, det er jo tyskerne tenker på det da. Du kan jo ikke si ren rase, her er for noe ren rase da, det er jo ingen det vet. Sånn, det tenkte ikke vi på i det hele tatt. Det gjorde vi ikke.
For the young Norwegian mothers, this may just have been a convenient place to give birth to an illegitimate child, away from the disapproval of family and neighbours. For the Nazi authorities, it was the cornerstone of their eugenic policy.
When Norwegian woman came to the doctor and it was stated that she was pregnant, the father was a German soldier, the case should be handed over to Lebensborn. And then she had to fill out all formulas with information about her parents and grandparents.
The Lebensborn project was a great success. The babies just kept coming. By the end of the war, there were 10,000 of them, almost all of whom were officially registered in the project's files. The Lebensborn buildings are still there. Paul Hansen and Tove Leila Strand were born in this one, Gotthard, a few miles outside Oslo. Today, Gotthard is a nursing home. When the Germans were there, it was well equipped and staffed by German nurses. The babies selected for the master race were to be well looked after. That is of little consolation to them today.
Så store var vi. Det er en rar tid.
Så det er så dumt at vi i grunn aldri skal bli kvitt dette stempelet.
Vi får aldri kvitt det. Vi er aldri kvitt det.
Ikke det?
Ikke før man kommer i graven. Men som sagt, jeg vil ikke ha noe grav. Jeg vil spres til vide og vinner. Så slipper vi å få det stempelet da også, vet du. Det er det som er.
The files on the Lebensborn kept during the Nazi occupation of Norway are now stored in the National Archives in Oslo. The Nazis kept a file on every child they knew to have been born to a German father. They kept detailed records of the medical history and racial background of the parents, and reports on the progress of their 8,905 prized offspring. Gert Fleischer has only vague memories of her father, but hopes to learn more about her place in the Lebensborn project by examining her file.
This is my birth certificate. And there is my Lebensborn number, 2620. That was the 17th of September, 42, up in the north. Here is the Gesundheitsnachweis, a medical check my mother had to go through. It says that she is 1 meter and 69 centimeter high. She weighs 69 kilos. Color of hair is dark blonde. Color of skin, ivory. Color of eyes, gray. Her hair, straight. Racial questions, then they conclude with Nordish and Lappish. And so on and so on. And they conclude with, it says it's not desirable that she has children in the society, the German society, of course, the Third Reich, because she has this Lappish blood. To have a file here, in the a Lebensborn file, is an offense because it's a file established on the basis of genetical hygiene, rasehygiene, as the German said, and it goes against everything I believe in. And to find myself in such a file is a huge offense.
Gert was rejected by the Germans because she had Lapp blood, but she and thousands of other Lebensborn children were soon to face a far worse fate in Norway because of their German blood. In May 1945, the Germans surrendered. Himmler committed suicide, and the Lebensborn project came abruptly to an end.
King Haakon and his government returned to Norway. A parade through the streets of Oslo marks the event.
Norway rejoiced as the war ended and the king returned from exile in London. But for the women who had taken German lovers, retribution was at hand.
Collaborationists are paid off in full measure for consorting with the enemy.
As in other European countries, women who had slept with German soldiers received harsh treatment when the war was over.
Public humiliation is, in reality, mild punishment for traitors.
Agnes Jensen watched and waited in fear as the women were taken away.
Ja, det huset jeg, vet du, for de satte dem på en lasteplan. Når dere var ved jernbanen der nå, så satte de på en lasteplan, og så der kunne de, og den lastebilen, jeg tror han som har fått bilde av det også, for der det bilde av den lasteplanen, og der kunne de spytte på dem og rive dem og kleppe hår av dem og herje med det som de ville.
The government did little to discourage the attacks. It was the beginning of a far-reaching campaign of revenge.
I think there was a feeling this was allowed. This was really allowed. And I think that some places in Norway you will also find that the local resistance groups were actually doing this maltreatment of women themselves, in the belief that this was, although not spoken, it was unofficially the policy of the government.
Collaborators had a hard time all over Europe, but in Norway the hatred extended to their children.
One has to understand the ambience after the war in Norway. The whole Norway hated the Germans so much that it was almost too much to ask of them to accept somebody like me, child of the enemy, child of the hated.
Det som var det verste for meg, det var det som skjedde i hjemmet. Av fysisk og psykisk vold. Så du kan tenke deg selv, når min egen mor kaller meg for ditt jævla tyskersvin. Ja. Så, og jeg husker det var ikke så lenge før jeg faktisk dro hjemmefra, så da var jeg begynt å få fysiske krefter selv, ikke sant? Da husker jeg sa til moren min at bare slå meg så mye dere vil seg, men vær så snill og ikke kall meg for det.
In this unforgiving atmosphere, Frida's mother struggled to bring up her child. There was no escaping the anger of their neighbours. Everybody in Ballangen knew that Frida's father was a German soldier. Mother and child were ostracised by the community.
Cindy's mother felt that this is not a good place for my granddaughter, which was Frida obviously, to grow up. So she decided that, we're going to Sweden because that's a safe environment, we can start a new life and no one knows who we are and all that. And eventually they ended up in a place called Torshälla. And soon after they'd arrived there, Frida's mother, Cindy, she came after. And she actually got a job there, and things were sort of looking up. But then something happened. One day she just collapsed at home. And she was rushed to the hospital, and it turned out that there was some problem with her kidneys. And there was surgery and all that, but it turned out that her life couldn't be saved.
Jeg synes det var forferdelig. Og kanskje verst tenkte jeg på hun Annifrid, at hun skulle bli fri for mor. For Annifrid var jo bare en liten jente da mora døde. Hun forstod jo absolutt ingenting ut av det som skjedde. Det kanskje var det meste man ble opptatt av. Det var det at Annifrid ble uten mor.
Frida was motherless, but she was at least safe in Sweden. For the Lebensborn children left behind in Norway, there was to be no escape. It wasn't just that they were hated as a reminder of the Nazi occupation. It was also widely believed, with a logic worthy of the Nazis themselves, that their German blood was defective and would make them fascist by nature. The Norwegian government wanted to deport the children to Germany, but this plan was vetoed by the Allies. A committee was set up. It asked for the opinion of Ernulf Erdegard, the country's leading psychiatrist.
Ødegaard actually it diagnosed the group of about 10,000 mothers and 10,000 children. He said that a large proportion of these people, they must be said to carry bad genes. Actually, they were more or less to be labeled mentally retarded. So, with a German soldier as a father and an unmarried mother, these children were genetically very bad, and they belonged in, in special institutions for the mentally retarded or feeble-minded.
In a staggering act of retribution, hundreds of small, healthy children were then forcibly incarcerated in mental institutions. Reidun Muking was just 2 years old when she was taken from the Lebensborn home where she was born and sent to MIJ, an institution for the mentally ill. MIJ is now a music school for children with special needs, but it holds haunting memories for Reidun.
Og så ga jo den lyden seg, og jeg hadde blitt veldig redd. Jeg fortsatte å skrike. Men da kom de ikke og sa at jeg skulle ligge med. Det var nattvakta. De satt fortsatt på... Da satt de bare på vantrommet og lot meg skrike. Da de brydde seg ikke å komme inn til meg. Og så snakket de med meg da. Og så skrek jeg nesten resten av natta. Og så kom de på vakt neste kveld, nattvakten. Og så fikk jeg form for straff da. At de bandt meg sånn med armer, sånn tvangstre med armer på bak ryggen da.
For 3 years, Reidun spent every night in a straitjacket.
Jeg hadde ikke behøvd å oppleve vært her da, hvis ikke norske myndigheter hadde sendt meg til Gåtob og at jeg ble feilplassert på mye gjort derifra.
Paul Hansen spent his childhood locked up in MIJ, condemned for having a German father. He remembers the shock of arriving there.
Men de lå i sengen hele tiden. De var sånn multihandikappede, som det heter i dag. De var rett og slett syke, de. Så tenkte som sa vi som var oppegående sånn, å blande seg med de, men det var ikke annen plass å få til oss. Derfor ble vi blandet sammen med de. Det verste var at vi satt og spiste og gjorde sitt fornødne på samme rom. Det var det verste, og så var disse skrikene om natten, det var det verste. Men ellers har det ikke vært noe fysisk dårlig behandlet eller noe sånt.
Paul is bitter about the way the Lebensborn families were treated by their government.
For våre mødre, de har fått mer straff enn den verste nazisten. Han slapp billigere han enn våre mødre gjorde, for de får straff helt opp til disse dager her. Og det synes jeg var en forferdelig en råtten tankegang, så det stinker lange veier. Det er en sammensvergelse både mot mødre og barn. Det er så forbannede urettferdig, altså. Det må ikke forekomme, og den tankegangen Norge skal være et eksemplarisk land, og vi er jo...
Very many of us have psychological problems. There have been suicides, alcoholism, destroyed lives, bad health, not getting the schooling, not getting into the labor market. There are a lot of destroyed lives.
Arnetine Lingstad was determined that her granddaughter Frida's life would not be ruined. In Sweden, nobody knew that Frida's father was a German soldier. But while life in the sleepy town of Torshälla was safe, Frida's childhood was far from ideal. With her mother dead and her father missing on the trip back to Germany, Frida was an orphan.
Torshälla was a very, very small place. Nothing was really happening. It was Dullsville, basically. And Frida was kind of a lonely child anyway. But she discovered music, and I think that was what saved her. She started singing with a jazz band, and that's where her professional musical career started, and she was only like 13 years old or something at the time.
By the time she was 17, Frida was a mother herself, but her career had stalled in the small town. Reluctantly, she decided to leave her family.
I think it obviously was a difficult decision for Frida to leave her children behind, but at the same time she was so emotionally unfulfilled at the time. She didn't really have a real childhood. She had to grow up much earlier than most children, and she was still searching for some kind of fulfillment. And I think her ambition was her version of emotional fulfillment at the time. That was the only thing she could find that could really give her good emotional payoff, was to sing and to meet the audience and have a good career and advance her career.
Frida soon caught the eye of veteran Swedish cabaret artist Charlie Norman, joining his popular show in 1969.
She was talk of the town among musicians. All the musicians like her singing. The guys in the band said, let's try that girl from Eskilstuna. We loved her because nice, friendly, good ear, a lot of laughs. She was wonderful.
But despite the newfound success, Frida still seemed to be struggling with her past.
She was shy and timid when there was a lot of people around, and she was not so fond that time to be on stage and to have a lot of people looking at her. I think she preferred studio, But as I remember it, she was not talking so much about herself, especially not if it's what you call kind of trouble or something. You don't mention it, no.
Nobody in her new life knew about her German father and her flight from Norway. By 1974, Frida was poised for international stardom. Her band, ABBA, had triumphed in the Eurovision Song Contest. Their win catapulted ABBA and Frida to fame and an unexpected twist of fate. At the height of their fame, journalist Harry Edgington was commissioned to write a biography of the band. It was the first time anyone had looked behind the scenes.
That time they were certainly the biggest pop group since the Beatles, and they were selling in numbers in some countries that even the Beatles had never sold, in places like Australia, certain countries in Europe. They were just a worldwide phenomenon. Nothing got out about their earlier life. So they would be presented as the four smiling, perfect Swedes.
While researching his book about ABBA, Harry uncovered Frida's secret, that her father had been a German soldier believed dead at the end of the war. The story was picked up by Bravo, a German pop magazine.
A little girl who was a reader of this magazine read the story about this man and about Frida, and she said, well, my uncle is Alfred Hase. He wouldn't be the one, would he?
The girl and her father spoke to Alfred Hase about the story.
Alfred Hase was shocked. He asked his brother, how do you know her? Well, yes, I know her. I met her when I was in Norway. And brother said, congratulations. You are the father of a very, very famous singer, one of ABBA, Frida.
The news came as a shock to Alfred, who claims he didn't know Cindy was pregnant. It was going to be even more of a shock for Frida.
The next step for Alfred, obviously, was to get in touch with his daughter. And he started phoning their offices in Stockholm and trying to get in touch with her. And she wouldn't come to the phone. She thought it was, a crank caller, because obviously as a pop star you attract all kinds of people.
You need to know that was the time, 1977, when ABBA was like absolutely super duper stars everywhere in the world. We phoned up the office of ABBA and told them, and they were, of course, very careful with it and shocked, because, anybody could come along and say, well, I'm Alfred Hase.
But it turned out that he knew things about her mother, and he knew things about the circumstances in Balang, and that he couldn't have known that unless he really knew Cindy Lyngstad.
Frida was uncertain and asked him to fly to Stockholm to see her. The meeting convinced her that Alfred really was the father she thought was dead. Frida was lucky enough to meet the father she believed was lost, but even she, protected from the cruelty meted out to others, has always been reticent about her family in public. For many of the Lebensborn children who grew up in Norway, their parentage has been the source of a lifetime of shame, guilt and oppression. And it seems that Norwegian society still can't accept the legacy of Hitler's plan or their own unthinking prejudice.
Jeg har ikke så godt øye til dem, fordi vi husker krigen for godt. Jeg var bare 18 år da krigen brøt ut. Og du vet, vi foraktet jo akkurat de som gikk sammen med fienden, da.
Ja, den har jeg litt trøbbel med å svelge noe særlig. Altså det at de skal ha erstatning for at de rota seg opp i noe sånt, det synes jeg får bli deres eget ansvar.
Her man kom til tysker tøs, man kan jo tenke på kanskje sin egen kjærlighetsforhold. Det var en norsk jente som ble glad i en tysk soldat, for eksempel. Det kan være en forklaring.
After 50 years of silence, a group of 122 Lebensborn children have started legal proceedings against the Norwegian government. They are asking for recognition for the abuses they have suffered. They've hired a lawyer, Randi Spidefold, to represent them. She has selected 7 of their claims to bring as a test case. But the cases have proved more of a personal challenge than she first imagined.
The hardest part was in the beginning, when I heard the stories. I heard grown-up adults, women and men, crying here, telling their story in detail for the first time. They dared to open it. Well, they had to open themselves, and they had to tell me, because I had to hear the story.
The Lebensborn are asking for compensation and an official apology for the wrongs that have been done to them.
Of course, there is no way of repairing a ruined life. But an apology and an economical compensation would help a lot of us live a little bit easier life in their old age.
At the first hearing, the Oslo City Court ruled against them. The next step was to take the case to the appeal court. The government lawyer argues that it all happened too long ago for the government to be held responsible. The hearing lasted 4 days, but the judge ruled in favour of the government and the group's case was thrown out yet again.
They're really getting in a fighting mood now. Even though the cases turn out to take a long time, they waited so long time, it doesn't matter. But they want it now, and they want it before they are getting too old.
For Randi, there's a hypocrisy at the heart of Norway, the home of the Nobel Peace Prize, a country that prides itself on resolving conflicts around the world, refusing to acknowledge its own victims of war.
I'm very disappointed and I'm embarrassed. I'm very embarrassed on behalf of my country. I thought that Norway was the great country in human rights, the best country. And I didn't disbelieve that at one moment before I took this case.
The legal case failed on a point of law, but now the Norwegian government has finally agreed in principle to compensate the Lebensborn children. For Gert, Frida's own story shows how hard it has been to struggle against the tide of rejection.
She was a member of ABBA. Everybody loved her all around the world. She should have been strong enough to be able to come forward and say, I'm a German child. Not even she dared. That tells something about the oppression and the shame that was brought upon us.
Frida was lucky enough to escape the fate of the other Norwegian Lebensborn. But the publicity-shy ABBA star has shunned the public debate now raging in Norway. After their first optimistic meetings, Frida and her father are no longer in regular contact. Frida Lyngstad now lives alone and is rarely seen in public.